I am an enjoyer of fiction, many types of fiction, and my favorite part about fiction would be, of course, world building. I am a massive enjoyer of lore about a world that in hindsight probably doesn't matter for the overall plot, but I don't care. I love that shit. It's the little details that authors make about their story that just intrigue me and overall get me into the story. It's the reason why I always come back to One Piece or Bleach after a very long time, because there's something about those worlds that I just want to know more about that pull me right back into the story. And when it comes to JoJo's, oh dear God, there is a lot of world building that I just don't think gets talked about a lot or is given a second thought. You have to remember, JoJo's is a series has as many panels as One Piece. That's a lot. So I won't be going over everything, just things I find intriguing about the series, and I would love to hear yours in the comment section down below. By the end of this, you'll realize that Araki is insane for half the shit he adds in the story. Also, I'm slightly sick, my bad. Enjoy! So starting in numerical order, let's start with Phantom Blood. I think the two biggest obvious things I have to talk about are Hamon and vampires, as there's some of the biggest things we're introduced to in the early parts of JoJo. Starting off with vampires first, as they first show up in the series, Araki doesn't build a monster. He builds a item or a weapon that evolves a person into a monster or some type of apex predator in some interpretations, at least going on later into part 2. This monster or apex predator is so deadly that the stone mask has this really weird byproduct of destroying everything around it for the sake of power, which is something we see with the Pillarmen, the Aztecs, and the Joestar bloodline later on in the series. The stone mask and vampires are not good, and speaking more about the vampire part, they're not your stereotypical vampire. I guess in a modern sense, they're not pretty boys with superhero-like powers. In JoJo's, they are quite literally creatures of the night with a very abstract set of powers who are hell-bent on feeding on people so they can get stronger. As Zappelli likes to say or insinuate, that they are just the darkness of a person in full force thanks to these powers, and the only way to keep these powers up is by eating other people. And with that, the stone mask and vampires threaten the world. But on the flip side of that, we do have the Hamon tribe, or just Hamon users. The fact that there is a subset of people in the world that just have the ability to breathe in such a way that they have the ability to replicate the waves of the sun is a really cool idea that doesn't get very elaborated on after this point. There's no really crazy lore dumps other than the fact that there are some people in Tibet that study Hamon, and there was a previous tribe somewhere in the world before the events of JoJo that also had these powers. But sadly, Araki leaves the mystery. This is going to be a common thing within JoJo's where Araki says something but never elaborates on it because it's just how he rolls. But due to this, it always brings me back thinking, what could it have been? I can speculate as much as I want trying to figure out what some mysteries could have been in earlier parts, but I'll never give you the concrete answer as I don't have that answer. It's just headcanon. But what I can say is that Hamon is just supposed to be the opposite to vampiricism / the stone mask. It is the good to the bad, the light to the darkness, and that's what part 1 just tries to set up. There are good forces and they are bad forces within the JoJo universe that are physically represented by these objects / abilities. In hindsight, it's really basic world building, but looking what's going to come in the future with Araki, I'm glad he starts it off very simple and easy. Now jumping into part 2 immediately, I'm going to start talking about the Pillarmen. As characters, I have a love-hate relationship with them, but as lore and just adding to the universe of JoJo, oh god, I love this. The entire backstory of the Pillarmen is fascinating. A race of super intelligent creatures other than humans existing in the shadows of prehistoric humans is really cool. And how they were wiped out in a single night, by the way, by 2 of them is something that I always will come back to as a incredible feat and something that really establishes how far a villain will go in this franchise to get what they want. As Cars just wanted to conquer the sun and become the ultimate life form with his race. The only person going with this idea was AC/DC, but the entire tribe saw that as, no, that's wrong. There are going to be, implications after that that are probably not going to be beneficial for the planet. I guess in a way, the old school Pillarmen tribe was a eco-friendly group in hindsight. It's really weird saying out loud, but I think that's the case. And since Cars is the original inventor of the stone mask, the man who, I guess technically if you want to look at it like this, is the originator of evil, would use the stone mask's powers to enhance his own, making him a super Pillarman, is what he technically is, and would also give the same powers to AC/DC, and in a single night would wipe out the entire clan. only saving 2 children at the very end of said night. I really have to thank Araki for doing this because it actually does put a lot of perspective on what the stone mask is and what the world in general has to deal with because of Cars. If Cars never looked into overcoming his weakness, the sun, he would have never made the stone mask and we would have not seen half the problems we do see in JoJo. He is the original instigator of the JoJo universe if you want to see it like that. And I'm glad that Araki takes the time to explain that in part 2, even if it's very brief, but it adds a lot to the world in the context of half the shit that's going to happen in this series because of it. Also, the tagline Cars, the ultimate life form, the origin of evil is a really cool title for a video. I might use that. Now here's the thing I don't think a lot of people give a second thought to. The origin of the Speedwagon Foundation and just the organization in general. I would find it really weird under everything that happens in JoJo's that nobody would take the time to look into what the hell is happening in their world. Just like in real life, there are people and organizations that will, of their own free will, figure shit out that they probably realistically don't need to figure shit out about, let's be honest. But the fact that Araki makes an organization to look into stands, Hamon, vampires, and the Pillarmen really makes the world feel more organic and real. To be honest, if it didn't, I'd actually, at least personally, might not like the series as much, as sometimes in other shonen anime and manga, it doesn't happen and it kind of does make me think, what does everybody around the world think about what's happening in X, Y, or Z series? But in JoJo's case, that is answered. At least somebody is wondering what's happening. And the organization is built on the relationship between Jonathan and Speedwagon originally, and they do help out the group every once in a while when they are needed, and I feel that's a nice callback every time they do it. I'd overall say for part 2, when it comes to the world part of world building, I think part 2 really nails it. So jumping into part 3, I'm not going to start off with stands first because there's a thing before that I want to really emphasize / talk about because I don't think anybody really talks about it whatsoever. That being Dio's influence over the world. While it's not the main focus of the part, later on in other parts it is implied during part 3 that Dio kind of had his finger in almost every pie. If you didn't get the analogy, Dio has control over everybody who are at least important in some way to him. It just shows that Dio has power over people thanks to his vampiric abilities that were established in parts 1 and 2. How the mask just has this ability to control people thanks to the darkness in said vampire's heart, and how it influences other things to happen in other parts because of this. It overall shows that the world is connected thanks to this asshole of a guy, but it still shows that it's overall connected and not just some loose story, even if it's not the focal point of said story. Now we're gonna get into probably what I'm gonna be talking about for the rest of the video, stands. Starting off in part 3, it starts off as this power system for the main character and cast to use against the villain that slowly evolves into, at least at the current day, some type of mechanism for the overall grander world plot for part 9. As stands now connect back to the ideas of gravity, fate, calamity, fortune, misfortune, and all of that. Part 3 starts off stands just being spirits of some kind that you just inherently have. You either get these stands by just naturally developing them, or they manifest over time, or you get them from somebody else in your family. And when you get them, you basically can have a large assortment of powers depending on your nature, and there you go. That's basically it for stands in part 3. They're more treated as a power system than anything that both villains and heroes can have, even animals to a certain extent. But very similar to part 2 and how it started to explain things for Hamon and vampires, part 4 explains more in depthly how stands work for the overall world. In this part alone, we get introduced to the stand arrows, stand rules, how stands overall affect the world when there's a lot of stand users nearby. It establishes a hell of a lot. So much so, it even starts to pick at the idea of the fighting spirit and life energy coming from people in this part, as stands aren't spirits, they're more connected to people in a grander way than we actually think. And later on in certain parts, it kind of does seem like that. Starting off with the stand arrows, while they're not fully explained here until part 5, it is interesting that there is an object that has the power to awaken stand abilities within a person. If they need an extra kick, if they can't naturally produce a stand. I will explain it more once I get to part 5, but for now, let's just go over stand rules. My favorite bit of world building for JoJo's is the stand rules. While some of the time they're inconsistent and are broken most of the time, there is one stand rule that is fairly consistent, if not just the only rule that is consistent, that being stand users will attract other stand users. This rule, in terms of world building for JoJo's, establishes that stands are now the glue that will hold every everything together, because stand users will always find another stand user, meaning the plot will always go forward. For example, Kira, the reason why he probably didn't get away with anything after he got Killer Queen is because of this rule. If he probably never got Killer Queen, he probably could have been a successful serial killer. Another example would be Jotaro Kujo and how his life turns out because of stands. Because of stands, the plot moves forward and it overall connects the world much better now. Araki basically sets himself up for success after this point, establishing this rule and going more into stand lore and how it all works. This rare supernatural phenomenon now makes sense why all of a sudden there's all these stand users in one spot when they're supposed to be kind of, unique and rare and spread out. That's why a place like Morio kind of makes sense in hindsight, because, well, stand users attract other stand users, and in Morio, for some reason, there is a high density of these guys. But the idea of this high density place of stand users happens a lot more than you think. It happens in Italy and it happens in a random Florida prison. Hell, it even happens in different universes. All low-key, by the way, as regular people just don't notice these things for whatever reason until they get basically unnoticeable, looking at you, Made in Heaven Poochie. Anyway, the last thing I would like to talk about in part 4 in terms of world building and the idea of stands is the fact that they're not evil spirits anymore. This part likes to dig into the idea of the fighting spirit with Koichi and how stands can evolve over time with different individuals, and also introduces the idea of stand psyche / the psyche of the user. More or less what I'm trying to say here is part 4 kind of establishes the idea that they're not spirits anymore. It's like the fighting spirit of the user's psychic energy, basically. It's kind of weird saying out loud, but that's basically what it is. So stands go from this kind of wacky new power system into this really well-established piece of, well, world building and lore to the JoJo universe now that really connects everything back to itself. I honestly have to give a round of applause to Araki for even coming up with an idea like this. It's really ingenious, honestly. And thankfully for Araki being the type of author to always wanting to continuously evolve something or push something forward, stand lore would always be, well, brought up again / always approved upon in some way or fashion after this point, major or minor. And when entering into part 5, this is where I don't know if Araki's either insane on how he just writes things or is a genius on how he writes things, because part 5 lore-wise is kind of honestly fucking weird. We get introduced to the ideas of fate and what the origin of the stand arrows are, and well, they are, in retrospective, kind of nuts. The reason why the stand arrows exist is because people back in ancient times wanted powers to rival that of an almighty god. And eventually later on in part 5, it is revealed through Gold Experience Requiem that kind of is true, and the original purpose of the stand arrows was eventually achieved. Whether or not you want to see that as really good world building is up to you, but the fact that it adds upon the pre-established stand lore and just makes that more interesting, I think is a great addition to the story. But the thing that comes from that, thanks to the King Crimson versus GR fight, is the idea of fate. This starts the trend for the rest of the franchise of the idea of fate, gravity, calamity, so on and so forth. Fate is something that you cannot escape in JoJo's, it is gravity. But when you try to manipulate that fate or manipulate that gravity, you will be hit by the universe in some fashion and be punished for it, as nobody can escape it. We see this with GR's ability to make a person experience death or near death an infinite amount of times as a punishment for trying to manipulate fate, that being with Diavolo, with him trying to manipulate fate. And we also do see it with Rolling Stones at the end of part 5 and how it will affect some of the members of the Bucciolati gang. Fate in JoJo's is something nobody can beat, hero nor villain, but that won't stop people from trying. Enter gravity with Dio and Pucci in part 6, with a little bit of retconning on Araki's part for Dio. Dio is now this very intellectual person during the events before part 3 that are taking place during part 6's flashbacks. It's funny thinking about it like that, but there is a conversation between Dio and Pucci that introduces the idea of gravity. Now, what is gravity? Well, to briefly explain it, gravity is the phenomenon, metaphysical and literally physical, of two people or objects or a myriad of things colliding with each other. And once their fates collide with each other, predestined fate will occur, allowing events to play out, more or less. While extremely simple to explain, it does highly complicate the plot of JoJo's, but makes it so much cooler to understand if you're really heavily invested into the plot of JoJo's in general, like I am. More or less, all the events in JoJo's from parts 1 1 through 6 to the very ending chapter involving the new universe, the Ireneverse as some people like to call it, have all been preordained by the universe itself. Everything from cars wanting to become the ultimate life form, making the stone masks, to stand users being attracted to other stand users, from little individual character plot points and character backstories were all caused by the universe trying to, well, make it to the ending of its universe, I guess. It's really complicated because there's a lot of things I didn't cover in this video because I'm, just worrying about like the major parts that I want to talk about. But like everything in JoJo's basically comes down to being reasonably explained because the universe said so, because it wanted things to interact with each other because of fate and gravity itself. And the only character to ever realize that is Dio himself. He kind of, I guess to just explain the plot here, somehow being at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years, figured out that gravity pulls people together. If he somehow can manipulate that gravity, he can then manipulate fate, having control over everybody. That's more or less the heaven plan summed up. But since he was defeated by Jotaro, he couldn't successfully do this plan, so that's where Pucci comes in to pick up where Dio left off. The addition to gravity in JoJo's is a wonderful piece for the main universe part of the franchise, as it's able to collectively tie everything in a beautiful knot and make everything in JoJo's connect back to each other seamlessly in any way possible. Then enhances already pre-established lore with stands, Hamon, vampires, characters, individual plots, everything. It just makes everything so much more grand and so connected, and just overall makes the JoJo world just feel so realistic in a sense, even though it's taking place in a very similar world to ours. But that's just fucking cool writing, man. I love it. That's what I'm just basically gonna say. Off script as hell, but man, I love it. And the fact that Pucci eventually makes a stand that has the ability to control this phenomenon and eventually fails because the universe just says no to it is just, I love it, man. Like all the little details and what Araki just writes down on these goddamn manuscripts is just amazing. I can't tell if Araki's insane or a genius, dude. I just love it. After part 6, we get introduced to the Steel Ball Run universe, where shit gets pretty wacky. Insane, actually. Actually not insane, just straight up fucking nuts. We are introduced to the idea of misfortune and fortune within Steel Ball Run thanks to the corpse of literal Jesus Christ. In specific, maybe Mormon Jesus Christ, or maybe how Araki views Jesus Christ. That is so weird saying out loud. But basically, the Saint Corpse introduces this idea within the Steel Ball Run universe of the idea of misfortune and fortune. Whoever controls the Saint Corpse has the ability to control that phenomenon. It's basically the entire plot and main focus of the Steel Ball Run race. Whoever gets the corpse parts basically becomes unbeatable, untouchable even. And when you're having the ability to manipulate misfortune and fortune with the corpse parts, you affect other people's fate and gravity, connecting back into the original universe, at least in some way. And also very similar to a stand like Made in Heaven, a stand that was developed to manipulate this phenomenon, Funny Valentine also gains the power / the stand evolution of D4C Love Train, which has the ability to manipulate fortune and misfortune that comes upon him, continuing the idea that stands are something much more than just spirits. They're something connected to the universe as a whole, and at the highest level of their power can manipulate universal constructs or concepts / laws of the universe itself, affecting the universe and the world around them. And this isn't just a little thing or just like a thing that shouldn't be really focused on. No, fortune and misfortune are a major factor in the Steel Ball Run story. It is as important, if not more important, than gravity and fate. And to be honest, you should probably be looking at all of those as pretty major in the story of JoJo's as a whole, something grander than the main characters themselves. Because without fortune, you probably wouldn't have the heroes winning at the end of their fights. Or, due to the misfortune in a lot of these characters' lives, or the calamity in these characters' lives, you wouldn't get them in the story to begin with in general, as a lot of them do have a lot of tragic backstories. Leading into part 8 JoJoian's main idea, Calamity. With all that good that happens in the universe, there has to be an equal to that, an equal amount of bad in the universe, an equal amount of calamity within the universe. The entire point of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure JoJoian is to break the curse, to break calamity, and the only way to do that is to have hope, just to keep on pushing every day to get out of that bad situation. That is the literal point of JoJoian, dog. We're getting to a point with Araki's writing of his universe and how he thinks is going almost philosophical in a sense of how everything operates, how the world works, and it's just him thinking, but just putting it down in paper in a more fictionalized form. And because he writes it in such a certain way, it makes his semi-realistic world world just that much better, because then it connects back into the real world. I think the best part of world building is when a fictional world and its world building connects back into the real world. I have to overall say Araki is a genius. I don't know if he's insane or just really creative, but he's able to make a well-crafted story that takes a while to get here. JoJo's is almost going on 37 years now, technically 36 as the recording of this video, but soon to be 37. But it's just amazing how he can do this. The sole fact that the Wonder Review versus Soft and Let Go Beyond fight can be summarized as Calamity versus the undominable human spirit / hope for a better day is just great if you look at it like that, and how it all connects back into the JoJo universe. It's amazing, man. I love this franchise and what it represents and how it all connects back into real life. And with part 9 being currently written and the ideas of mechanisms within the world, we'll see where that goes, but seeing Araki's previous track record and his long history of writing this franchise and building the world he has been building, I'm genuinely pretty excited to see what part 9 has in store. So with that being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated. See you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.